Is the reaction from share markets proof that Trump's tariffs are going to have a significant impact on the global marketplace?
Quite probably. Shares were already looking elevated in a lot of locations. So they were looking perhaps for a reason to sell off. And what could be a North American trade war leading to a global trade war, you would think might be exactly that trigger.
Australia isn't among the initial tariff targets, but its largest trading relationship is with China, which is now facing an additional 10% tariff on those already in place on certain goods. How will the US trade war impact Australia?
Well, it's unlikely to be impacted directly in too many sectors, given that the trade relationship between Australia and the US isn't that large. And there aren't too many sectors which are going to be problematic and have friction. But yes, depending where the US goes from here, it looks very much like they are pressing ahead quite aggressively with trying to make sure they run much smaller trade deficits with all the countries that run a big surplus with them. And most of those are in Asia, and most of those are partners with Australia. So the people that Australia likes exporting to are likely to be hit by this.
Is China going to need as many Australian exports?
Well, let's be blunt. China has not exactly been going gangbusters in terms of its growth of Australian exports for the past couple of years for various reasons. This won't help, but I don't think it's going to do anything to really shift the needle or move the needle in terms of where China was planning to go vis-a-vis Aussie exports anyway.
The Australian miner Rio Tinto has aluminium operations in Canada that export to the US. Are there other big sectors that do face indirect fallout from what Donald Trump has announced?
Well, many of them, and we won't even see what they are straight away. Some of them will be second order rather than first order effects because trade is a complex system. And when you start playing Jenga with it and pulling pieces out, things can come toppling down, as we found out during COVID when we saw what supply chain pressure looks like. I think the important thing to recognize here too, just to reiterate, is this is what we have seen so far. If Canada and Mexico retaliate, and they've pledged to do so in the near future, Trump has said he will increase the US tariff. So the trade war gets exponentially worse. And above and beyond that, even if we come to a deal between Canada and Mexico, my personal suspicion is that that will be to have a united front in terms of an external tariff against other countries. And again, China is likely to be in the firing line.
What would that look like?
Well, remember, the US is in a free trade agreement with Canada and with Mexico, but all three of them have different external tariffs versus China. So it's a very simple, logical picture. Let's say the US puts a really high tariff on China going forwards, which seems quite likely, and Canada doesn't, and Mexico doesn't. What will China do? It will sell all its products to Canada and Mexico, and they'll come across the border without a tariff because they've come in via Canada or Mexico. So in order to ensure that the US can fight a trade war against China, it needs to have Canada and Mexico as its northern and southern border tied in to a particular trading relationship. And equally, in terms of Trump's words, he wants that to be a security relationship too. So I suspect that what we're seeing is an attempt to try and get one's own broader house in order, if you will, geopolitically, before Trump then goes off on further adventures. So this is probably just a warm-up for the real thing.
We've seen investors move towards gold, long been considered a safe haven in times of market volatility. What are the broader implications now for inflation, growth and interest rates, both globally and in Australia?
Well, let's disaggregate them. For growth, it's going to be a short-term negative, particularly for Canada and Mexico, less so for the US. And in the longer run, it could actually be good for the US, but still bad for Canada and Mexico. In terms of inflation, it's going to be inflationary for all of them. So in other words, it's stagflation for Mexico and for Canada more likely, and inflation in the US. In terms of interest rates, again, logically, you would say, okay, they have to stay higher for longer everywhere, which Australia isn't going to want to hear. But at the same time, you can't rule out the fact that in the current environment, Trump doesn't start leaning on the Fed to say, well, I want to see lower interest rates, and politicizing them too. He's already alluded to that in the past, even if he's backed off a couple of times. So there's a big question mark over that. And what does that do for the long-term cost of funding? Does that mean that you have certainty and it's going to come down even if inflation is high? Well, that certainly shakes up asset markets. Or are you going to have increased uncertainty and you get much higher borrowing costs longer term because people just simply don't know what the short-term cost of money is going to be and where it should be vis-a-vis inflation? So volatility really is the simple answer.
If Australia is targeted with tariffs, what should the Australian government do? How should it respond?
Well, here's the interesting thing. If you talk to most economists and analysts, they'll tell you that tariffs are a gun to your own head inflationary tax on consumers. They'll all tell you that. And then if someone puts tariffs on you, they say, well, we're going to put tariffs back. So how stupid is that? Someone puts a gun to their own head in their eyes, and you respond by saying, right, I'll put a gun to my own head. If you're going to be a purist about it, like a real free trader, if that's Australia's stance, then you don't put any tariffs up. You just say, okay, that country's being stupid enough to make our stuff more expensive. That's silly. Their consumers are going to suffer. Pity on them. We'll keep buying things from the rest of the world. I almost guarantee you that won't be the case, and that if we were to get that, there'll be some form of retaliation, at least threatened. But that just goes to show you that people don't actually believe in this free trade theory at the end of the day. And there's a lot more realpolitik in the background than they're prepared to admit.
Michael Every, thank you for your insights.
Thank you.